The first discussion topic on today's Peace and Prosperity is Pyongyang and Washington's opposing statements on the outcome of their much-anticipated working-level talks. North Korean and U.S. delegations sat across from each other at the negotiating table in Stockholm, Sweden on October 5th, only to return home empty-handed.
우리가 이미 미국 측에 어떤 계산법이 필요한가를 명백히 설명하고 시간도 충분히 주었음에도 불구하고 미국이 빈손으로 협상에 나온 것은 결국 문제를 풀 생각이 없다는 것을 보여줍니다.
After their first talks in more than 7 months, North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator, Kim Myong-gil, said negotiations broke down, blaming the U.S. team's old attitude. U.S. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus released a statement denying the North's account, saying the U.S. brought creative ideas and had good discussions with its North Korean counterparts. What really happened during the talks, and why did North Korea claim that they broke down? The second discussion topic is the possibility of North Korea's additional provocation amid the breakdown of the talks. A few days before the working-level negotiations in Stockholm, the North test-fired an SLBM. Immediately after the talks, it warned it might consider lifting a self-imposed ban on ICBM tests.
우리의 핵시험과 ICBM 시험 발사 중지가 계속 유지되는가, 그렇지 않으면은 되살리는가 하는 것은 전적으로 미국의 입장에 달려 있습니다.
The North's move could be concerning for U.S. President Donald Trump, who has touted Pyongyang's moratorium on nuclear and ICBM tests as its biggest foreign policy success. The U.S. accepted Sweden's invitation to come back to Stockholm in 2 weeks for another round of discussions with the North, while North Korea said it won't meet with the U.S. for more negotiations like the latest meeting. How likely is the North to return to ICBM test? And how will this affect its future nuclear dialogue with the U.S.? To shed light on these latest developments, our host, Bong Young-sik, research fellow at Yonsei University's Institute for North Korean Studies, is joined by Carl Friedhoff, a fellow in public opinion and Asia policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. To broaden the perspective, we also connect with guest experts on Skype, including Mark Fitzpatrick, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation, and Victor Teo, Assistant Professor at the University of Hong Kong.
Hello and welcome to our program. North Korea and the United States finally sat down for working-level talks 100 days after the surprise Kim-Trump encounter at the DMZ, but the two sides failed to narrow their differences. We take a look at why the meeting fell apart and what lies ahead. We have a very special guest in the studio today. We have Mr. Carl Friedhoff, a fellow in Public Opinion Asia Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in the studio. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right, my first question is about this breakdown in the working-level meeting in Stockholm. North Korea, at least that's what North Koreans describe, the meeting. So what is the cause of this breakdown if North Koreans' assessment is indeed correct?
So I think we're still stuck in the big deal versus the small deal conundrum. The fact that the United States is still seeking a big deal by which North Korea will denuclearize all at once, and North Korea is looking at the small deal, something that will be incremental, and over time they will give up pieces. And during the time that since they last met, North Korea has also developed and announced new capabilities, and so their expectations have also shifted.
Well, but some people suggest that the Ambassador Kim Myong-gil, the North Korea's main person in the negotiations, seems to be already determined to make a breakdown.
Well, when North Korea went to those meetings, like all good diplomats, if they have a strategy, they probably have two separate strategies based on developments that have happened. So when they enter the meeting, if they don't hear something they like, they have a statement already prepared. But if they feel that the United States has made a course change in the fact that they may be more moving towards something that is acceptable from North Korea, then the negotiations can continue on.
You work in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, so you must know this very well. But what about the U.S. side? Looking at this breakdown of the talks, were there any creative and substantial ideas and proposals prepared by the U.S. team?
Well, the U.S. has certainly said that there were. They said they came with a good
That's
deal.
a State Department explanation.
New kind of circumstances for them, and they were ready to achieve something new. However, it's quite a leap if you're going to move from absolute denuclearization up front and then more towards a small deal, which would imply arms control. And of course, that is going to worry the U.S. And its South Korean allies very much in the fact that it may lock in North Korea's nuclear program rather than try to eliminate it.
If there were any new, more flexible approaches prepared by the United States government this time, then what would be the examples or candidates?
Well, the thing that's been talked about the most is Yongbyon plus Alpha.
Right.
The fact that they would verifiably dismantle Yongbyon plus something else. That may be an end to the uranium enrichment program. I think the question is really on the side of what is the U.S. willing to give up? Is it ready to lift sanctions in a way that will allow the North Korean economy to begin to grow?
Right, good. Now we'll hear reactions and observations from Washington. Joining us on the line is Mark Fitzpatrick, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation under the George W. Bush administration. Hello.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me on Arirang television. I've been a fan of Arirang for many years, and I think this might be my first time in many years to be interviewed. So thank you.
You're welcome. We are very pleased to have you. My first question is, North Korea said the latest working level negotiation with the U.S. broke down, while U.S. called the talks good discussions. What can explain the difference in their statements?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure that either side really has great credibility when it comes to describing the outcome. The North Koreans always would be counted on to prevaricate and to claim that it was terrible, even if it wasn't so bad. And the Americans under President Donald Trump have an incentive to say everything went well. Normally, the Americans would be fairly straightforward, but under the current political circumstances, I'm sorry that the U.S. side has less credibility.
What observations are being made within U.S. since you're there regarding the outcomes of working level talks? Although you said that there's a tendency inside the Trump administration to make a positive spins.
In Washington, one hears two kinds of responses. The dominant response is that this shows that North Korea has no interest in denuclearization, something that President Trump and his team should have realized long ago. There's a great deal of suspicion and anger about North Korea. But there's another response one hears in Washington, which is that this apparent breakdown demonstrates that Trump's policy of maximum pressure has not worked and that the U.S. administration needs to adopt a different kind of policy. Now, I think, frankly, that the U.S. side did adopt a revised policy. At least those were the press reports ahead of time. So I expected that the talks would go better than they apparently did.
Dr. Fitzpatrick, you served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation in the George W. Bush administration. How would you compare the current approach from the Trump administration to previous approaches under other administrations?
Oh, well, President Trump's way of conducting diplomacy is very poor compared with all of his predecessors. His demand to centralize everything in his own persona means that he is easily played. He does not pay close attention or any attention to the briefing materials that are prepared for him. And he thinks that through the force of his personality, he can persuade the other side, which we've found out he can't. So I'm sorry to say that U.S. diplomacy under the current president is faring very poorly.
Secretary Fitzpatrick, thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, Mr. Friedhoff, what's your overall reactions to Secretary's assessment of the first working level meetings, and The Washington Post, citing the former Pentagon official, said the breakdown of talks in Stockholm, I'm quoting, revealed the risk of Trump's personal diplomacy, end quote. So end of the personal chemistry diplomacy?
So I think Dr. Fitzpatrick is spot on in this in saying that when Trump is trying to push these through because he sees himself as the ultimate deal maker, essentially he's exposing himself to be taken advantage of. What history has shown us in, well, the short history of the Trump administration is that he's apparently very bad at making deals. The deals that he has made have been only minor revisions, and he's actually taken actions that have moved us further away from security, for example, on an issue like Iran, than closer to that.
Will he be more willing to admit that he was mistaken? He's going to be admitting his own mistakes.
Of course not. Throughout the Trump administration, we have never seen him admit that he makes a mistake. And in fact, we've seen him, when he's called out on anything, he doubles down. Even if he decides to reverse course on North Korea, let's say he's going to go back to this, he'll never admit that he was wrong in the first place. Instead, he'll seek to blame the media, he'll seek to blame the North Koreans, but it will never be his fault.
Very interesting. All right. Speaking about the working level talks, one U.S. media outlet said the North was resorting to its characteristic brinkmanship to gain leverage over Washington. Here's a short clip to help you understand the game of brinkmanship that North Korea has played for many years.
A New York Times article detailing the breakdown of working-level talks in Stockholm said North Korea was resorting to its characteristic brinkmanship to gain leverage over Washington rather than giving up dialogue completely, citing officials and analysts. Brinkmanship is the practice of pushing a situation to the brink of war to achieve a desired outcome. North Korea has long employed brinkmanship to win concessions in its nuclear negotiations with the international community. A prime example of North Korea's brinkmanship is the 1994 Geneva Agreement between Pyongyang and Washington. When the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, adopted a resolution in 1993 requiring North Korea to open military sites to inspection, the North announced it would leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. In March the following year, North Korea threatened to go to war and turn Seoul into a sea of flames. 3 months later, it announced its withdrawal from the IAEA. As the North brought the Korean peninsula to the brink of war, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter traveled to Pyongyang to broker a diplomatic solution. North Korea and the U.S. signed an agreed framework in Geneva in October 1994, which marked a dramatic turnaround from the crisis. North Korea agreed to freeze its nuclear programs in exchange for 200-megawatt light water reactors and 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil per year. North Korea's brinkmanship continued into the 2000s, when the U.S. cut off its supply of heavy fuel oil to the North in 2002. Pyongyang withdrew from the NPT in 2003 and reactivated a nuclear reactor. When the U.S. sanctioned a Macau-based bank, Banco Delta Asia, in 2006 for laundering money for Kim Myong-gil, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test, sending shockwaves around the world. North Korea has a track record of proactive brinkmanship involving its nuclear and missile programs.
Personally, I think it was very interesting that Ambassador Kim Myong-gil took only 10 minutes after he walked away from the meeting room, took out the statement and read it, criticizing the United States, assigning all the blames for breakdown to the United States. So once again, I'd like to ask you whether it was prescripted, that North Korea did not want any success at all.
That is certainly one way to read it. I would be surprised if they didn't have an alternative option. But what I do think is interesting about that is the way it has turned the negotiations on its head, especially if you read Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and his other comments. He's always said you have to be willing to walk away.
Right. And he did in Hanoi.
He did in Hanoi, and now the North Koreans have done it to him. They have walked away, and I think in a hope to kind of regain control of where these negotiations are headed.
All right. But at the same time, was there any possibility that North Korea had a higher hope to expect a bigger concessions from the United States after the resignation of Mr. John Bolton, right? much loved, guy for North Koreans.
Yes, I believe they've called him human scum on occasion, so the love was certainly on display from the North Koreans, but there should have been an expectation, and I think the Americans as well expected that the Trump administration would be more willing to be flexible with Bolton out. The feeling was that Trump himself wanted to be flexible and to approach a deal with North Korea, but with Bolton and others, hardliners in his ear telling him not to do that, that we saw the breakdown in Hanoi.
Maybe North Korean delegates did not see any sign of United States with a different position without John Bolton, right?
Right, and so now they're probably going to go back, recollect their strategy, and I think, as I mentioned previously, we really need to look at this as North Korea has shown new capabilities. They expect that the Trump administration now needs to offer them more, and so the goalposts have now been shifted.
Will it work that North Koreans are going back to brinkmanship diplomacy toward the United States? It seems to be quite successful from the North Korean standpoint in the past, but now you're dealing with the Trump administration. So, using the brinkmanship strategy once again, will it work for North Koreans?
So what we've seen in the past is the Trump administration is going to meet brinksmanship with more brinksmanship. We could easily see a return to escalating tensions, the fire and fury tweets. That could certainly play out. But my sense is that the Trump administration and President Trump himself is looking for some kind of progress, is looking for some kind of foreign policy win, where we may not get back to that. What Trump has demonstrated repeatedly is that he is unwilling to use force, and the North Koreans have been paying attention. There were the missiles launched into Syria, but those were at bases. There was pre-warning against those missile launches. But on Iran, he has also essentially backed down. Iran has disappeared largely from the news cycle, and I think North Korea is looking at those examples and betting that brinksmanship, they can ratchet up tensions and there will not be force coming out against them.
Another reason why North Korea's brinkmanship is concerning is that it may lead to ICBM tests. A few days before the working level negotiations, North Korea test fired on SLBM, and immediately after the talks, it warned of ICBM tests. What is an SLBM and an ICBM? And how are they different? Here's more on the story.
Shortly after the breakdown of working-level talks between North Korea and the U.S. in Stockholm, North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator, Kim Myong-gil, raised pressure on the U.S., warning about the possibility of an ICBM test.
우리의 핵시험과 ICBM 시험 발사 중지가 계속 유지되는가, 그렇지 않으면은 되살리는가 하는 것은 전적으로 미국의 입장에 달려 있습니다.
An intercontinental ballistic missile, or an ICBM, is designed to deliver nuclear weapons. North Korea claimed to have developed ICBMs following the test firings of the Hwasong-14 and 15 missiles in 2017. Launched from the ground, an ICBM is a multi-stage missile that uses solid or liquid fuels to travel from one continent to another. It flies above the atmosphere and has a range of over 6,400 kilometers. On the other hand, a submarine-launched ballistic missile, or an SLBM, is a ballistic missile launched from submarines. 3 days before the Stockholm talks, North Korea test-fired a new type of SLBM named Pukguksong-3, raising tensions on the Korean peninsula. The Pukguksong-3 is estimated to have a diameter of 1.4 to 1.65 meters, 0.3 meter larger than the Pukguksong-1. It is also 2 to 3 meters longer in length. The maximum range of the Pukguksong-3 is believed to be over 2,000 kilometers, while for the Pukguksong-1, it is 1,300 kilometers. The new SLBM can carry up to 8 warheads, which gives it the capability to engage multiple targets simultaneously. SLBMs are hard to detect and strike, as they allow clandestine underwater operations. Currently, only 6 countries have mastered SLBM technology, including the U.S., the U.K., China, Russia, France, and India. U.S. President Donald Trump has kept a muted response to North Korea's repeated short-range missile tests and latest SLBM launch. But it will be a different story if the North decides to fire an ICBM, which could threaten the mainland U.S. The possibility of the North's ICBM test has further complicated Washington's strategic calculus.
You correctly pointed out that President Trump likes to single out as a big achievement, only made possible by him, that North Korea has not conducted any more ICBM tests. Since he engaged in a dialogue with Chairman Kim Jong-un. Will it change? Ambassador Kim Myong-gil, after the breakdown of the working level negotiation, actually threatened that if the United States would not change its attitude, then it cannot be ruled out that North Korea may go back to the test of the ICBMs. How likely is it?
So I don't think we're going to see ICBM tests in the near future. If we go back to where North Korea has been, there's been a lot of talk about the short-range missile test. And they've often been labeled as provocations. I think the better term for that is normalization.
Normalization? What do you mean by normalization?
The fact that we've known for a long time that the Trump administration was only focused on ICBMs.
Right.
And so this gave approval, essentially, of North Korea to continue to launch short-range missiles, and now they're locking that in as an acceptable part of their weapons program. So they've launched them. The U.S. has not responded. South Korea has not responded. Japan has not responded. So now they're going to step up from short range. Now that it's accepted, they're now going into medium range, which the SLBM was, and they'll continue to launch medium range missiles with no response. So I would assume 2 to 3 months of medium range missile launches, and then perhaps around the new year, if there's no progress, they may then jump to ICBMs, but that would be a very risky move.
All right. We now turn to an expert outside the U.S., Victor Thae, assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, who specializes in international relations in Asia-Pacific region. Welcome to our program, Professor Thae.
Right. Thank you for having me on the show.
North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator, Ambassador Kim Myong-gil, said whether North Korea will keep the moratorium on nuclear and ICBM testing is completely up to the United States. What do you make of his remarks?
I think to a large extent this is true. And that is because the goals of the DPRK have not been met. They are actually looking for 3 things. I think, first of all, they want the sanctions lifted. Secondly, they want to resume some sort of relationship with the United States. And here I'm talking about the normalization of relationship with the U.S. And 3, I think eventually they are looking for a peace treaty. I think they have very cordial relationship with the Republic of Korea. As cordial as it gets, given a long history. And to that extent, I think Pyongyang is actually looking for the existential threat to be lifted. So they are looking for a gesture from the United States, but the United States have always insisted that denuclearization, complete, verifiable denuclearization, be conducted by Pyongyang before they can take a step ahead in the relationship. And so I think it's tough because the North Koreans have felt that they have actually done enough to demonstrate the sincerity, but the Americans are actually not giving anything to them. So to that extent, I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea go back their old ways.
Professor Thae, there was a lot of expectation that Kim Jong-un may time a visit to China on October 6th around China's 70th anniversary. That did not happen, perhaps because the Kim regime was focusing on the working level talks with the United States, which we now know have failed. In doing so, did he lose 2 opportunities at once?
I do not think the DPRK has failed at both. In fact, I think we should see the North Korea's relations with China as being separate from North Korea's relations with the U.S. It's possible that the North Korean leader has been focusing on the talks in the U.S., but at the same time, it's also possible that the DPRK doesn't want to showcase advancements that the Chinese Communist Party has made. I don't think the DPRK's U.S. policy is failing because North Korea has a long-standing strategy of either making the Americans choose, either go to talks or let us test our weapons. And every time the Americans do not go for talks, the North Korea do their best to make advancements in their weapon technology. So, it's in some ways, ironically, a win-win situation for the DPRK, notwithstanding the fact that the sanctions have been imposed on them. But either way, the Americans are not going to leave the sanctions just because of Pyongyang asked them to. So it's really, isn't there's nothing much to lose. Let me put it. So I do not think that both the DPRK's China or U.S. policy is not working. In fact, I think the North Korea leader is actually managing things pretty well.
Victor Thae, Assistant Professor at the University of Hong Kong. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Friedhoff, your overall response to Professor Thae's analysis?
So across his analysis, it seems like we agree on quite a few points, but what I really like that he has done is really focused on the domestic politics of the DPRK. I think the reality is when we think about North Korea, we often think about their relations with China, with South Korea, with the United States, and we forget that because he is a dictator, we forget that he also has domestic politics to consider, especially considering the rival factions that we know exist there, and that his position may not be as solidified as we often assume.
Okay. This is going to be my final question to you then. What do you expect from President Trump? Not Trump administration, but President Trump in the short term and in the long run. You mentioned his choice lying between no action, amelioration to North Korea to double down. So could you be more specific on what Trump is likely to do?
So in the short term, we'll see President Trump respond to this most recent walkout by the North Koreans by sending his negotiators back, telling them to try to work out a deal. I also expect we'll see some exchange of letters. He'll come out, he'll send a letter to Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un may send a letter to President Trump. And I think that would be a smart move because walking out on him, while at first it kind of embarrasses him, a letter, it gives him something that he can then boast about. Right. So in the short term, this kind of back and forth is going to continue. In the longer term, it's really unclear how this is going to play out. If they do back President Trump into a corner, we know that that is something that is going to be imminently possible for them to do via an ICBM, and then we'll see him respond in kind, and we'll go right back into the escalatory ladder, which is going to be dangerous for everyone, especially considering he'll need to look tough right ahead of an election and amidst the impeachment. However, if he is ready to sit down with the North Koreans, and Kim Jong-un in particular, at a third and possibly a fourth summit, there's a very real risk, and I would say it's a risk, that he could sign a poor peace treaty, a poor peace agreement, and that is something the North Koreans will try to lock in, and how that plays out after that, the consequences of that could be really far-reaching.
All right, Mr. Friedhoff, it is immensely pleasant to have you actually in the studio for this program. And
thank you.
We'll be in touch on the line through Skype.
Thank you.
Right. Bonsai this week is brinkmanship diplomacy. Brinkmanship diplomacy has been the hallmark policy of North Korea throughout the history of the nuclear crisis. But President Trump stole the thunder from the North Koreans and practiced it. He abruptly sent a personal letter to Chairman Kim Jong-un and canceled the first meeting in Singapore. Later, Trump walked away from the second summit meeting in Hanoi, Vietnam, with no agreement. It seems like North Koreans are determined not to be outdone by Trump in playing brinkmanship diplomacy. The working-level negotiations in Stockholm broke down, and the North Korean government said it had no desire to engage in sickening negotiations with the United States anymore. Let's see how the Trump administration will respond. And that's all we have for you today. We hope you enjoy the program, and thanks for watching.